So welcome to week 3. This is when our text and our content will actually get pretty exciting and engaging, especially considering everything that's going on in the United States society these days. So a lot of chaos and tumultuousness. So one thing about social psychology is the research has been going on for a long time. So we've noticed some patterns in behaviors before. It just now appears that these patterns have really emerged acutely where they affect each one of us very deeply. So if you would, please turn to page 77 in your books and follow along. This will be chapter 3, Social Beliefs and Judgments. And I start with a quote by Bertrand Russell. The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wiser people so full of doubts. You see the same quote, in essence, from Thomas Jefferson. The wise know their weakness too well to assume infallibility, and he who knows the most knows best how little he knows. So again, I think they are maybe the same side or opposite sides of the same coin, trying to say the same thing. We will see that theme emerge in our text this week, in this discussion, and also on your online discussion. First of all, I want to reiterate what we went over last week. And so we went over how each one of us are composed of our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And each one of these things impacts the other. So our feelings can influence our thoughts. Our feelings can also impact our behaviors. Our thoughts certainly can impact our behaviors. And what we learned last week is our behaviors can actually influence our thoughts and feelings, which is backwards than what we normally assume. But we left out of the equation our internal beliefs. And our internal beliefs are influenced by all of those facets of this system of what makes us human. And so we'll talk more in depth about our beliefs coming up. So we're going on to a deeper level. And our beliefs do influence our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. And vice versa, and the outside world. So there are a lot of impacts that have an influence on our beliefs. And so what we're going to talk about is how understanding beliefs how they can actually skew our view of reality. And that is very evident. There's also a quote in your text on page 77, at the very bottom of the page. An old Chinese proverb says, 2/3 of what we see is behind our eyes. So how do our beliefs impact and our judging impact the social world? And why are social beliefs important? Well, they're efficient in influencing thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Definitely, we determine those three many times. Presumably, they've helped lead to survival. And they provide, underlying beliefs provide a capacity for automatic, efficient, and intuitive thinking. However, cognitive efficiency also produces occasional errors. So, you see this in prejudice. And a lot of times prejudice is driven by fear. We have an irrational fear of the unknown, or we automatically presume all people may be this way because we've observed this in one of another people of an out-group. So we talked a little bit about in-groups and out-groups last week. That will reemerge a lot throughout the semester. So what would happen if you constantly had to reassess your deepest beliefs in every situation? Well, it'd be really slow. We'd have a hard time interacting with people. We'd have a hard time, interacting in the world because we'd always be constantly assessing what we were thinking. Our beliefs lead to something called the overconfidence phenomenon. So people were given a chance to respond to this question. And so we have a tendency to be more confident than we are correct. So we overestimate the accuracy of our beliefs. So this statement was given to a number of people. I feel 98% certain that the air distance between New Delhi and Beijing is more than blank miles, but less than blank miles. So you might consider that yourself. So what would you answer there? I don't know what you might answer, but when they gave this out to many participants, respondents were only 70% correct. So you'd think, my gosh, why couldn't they just say like 2 miles and less than like 30,000 miles? But you know, you'd surely be like 100% correct if you did that, but that's not what respondents did. So people are markedly overconfident, and there are other examples of that as well. So you might look through your text. When judging whether someone is telling the truth, so we become overconfident, and these are some of those examples. When we believe that someone else is telling the truth, we are not always so good at that. We're also not so good at estimating the sexual history of our dating partners. We don't do so well with that aspect. And also, people are given like a survey to give like the activity preferences of their roommates, and they are astoundingly wrong. But they are overconfident in their choices. There are things that describe this phenomenon, and I would really strongly recommend that you take time to view both of these videos. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's on page 89 of your text. It does a lot to describe what's happening in our society. It does a lot to describe why things are the way they are right now. And so I would strongly recommend that you watch these videos and read for yourself the information in the text. We're in a strange situation, and I believe it has a lot to do with this Dunning-Kruger effect. And if you have faulty beliefs, and you might pause it there and then come back and watch this. But if you do have faulty beliefs, then you can come upon this thing called confirmation bias, and that's on page 91. Confirmation bias is also very important too. It'll be a theme that emerges throughout our discussions this semester. And what confirmation bias is, it's a tendency to search for information that confirms your own perceptions, your own beliefs. So rather than look for information that challenges you or refutes something that you might look at the opposite side of the coin, people really try to go and find information that supports what they already believe. And so I just saw today, ironically, I don't know if it's ironic or not, but I saw on social media that something popped up that said certain political group, now 66% of a certain political group believe that internet search engines are biased against them. And so again, it's confirmation bias. You go and look for information that confirms your own perception. And it may not be out there, but studies regarding confirmation bias were conducted before the development of social media. So this phenomenon has been out there a long time. And so how might social media influence this bias? Would it tend to exaggerate or lessen this bias? There's some other things that are important. Many times people develop what's called an illusory correlation. They believe there's a relationship between two things when really none exists. And so, like for instance, you could say, well, I don't think I'll give you an example here because we're running short on time, but you might read in your textbook about illusory correlation. Also, we have this illusion of control, and it's the perception that uncontrollable events are really subjects to our own control, or more controllable than they are. And then also, there's another important aspect to this. It's called regression toward the mean. And there's a statistical tendency for extreme scores or behavior to return to towards one's average. That's on page 97 of your text. Something else called attribution theory. It explains how we make sense of other people's behavior. So the big thing about attribution theory is we can believe that something is internally, like an internal disposition, it's like something that's a character in somebody. They have enduring traits, motives, a person's disposition, Or do you give it a situational attribution? Do you think that, well, it's external events that are causing this? So on page 101, for instance, there's a student sleeping. So, you might ask yourself, why is that student sleeping? Is it because that person is inherently lazy, or is it because that person maybe just didn't get a good night's sleep last night? So believing that student is just lazy, doesn't care, that would be a dispositional attribution. You believe that's something internal about themselves. Or if you believe that maybe they just didn't get a good night's sleep last night, that'd be a situational attribution. It has nothing to do with their character. This is important, because we have a tendency to mistakenly attribute a behavior to the wrong source. This is called a spontaneous trait inference. So we have these prejudices that occur within each of us, and it's an effortless, automatic inference of a trait after exposure to someone's behavior. So we believe, like this student, we might believe that student's just lazy and doesn't care about the grade in her class. Especially like, for instance, think if you're cut off during traffic, what are your first thoughts about that person? Why, you son of a, you know, your first thoughts about that person are probably that they're not a good person, and that would be a dispositional attribution versus a situational. Maybe that person is just in a hurry and they didn't see you there. I know I know what my own tendency is there. And that leads us to something very, very important throughout the rest of the semester. And that is the fundamental attribution error. This is the tendency for observers to underestimate situational influences and overestimate dispositional influences upon others' behaviors. In other words, we believe that's a flaw in their character versus something that external has happened. So we tend to attribute too much blame to people's character while not enough on the situation. This happens a lot in individualistic societies like the United States. So look on page 107 for that. Collectivist societies, not as much. So consider locus of control. So that is a related term, locus of control. Something that's internal, we can control it internally, internal locus control versus external. We really have somewhat limited ability to control things externally. Many children who live through divorce develop this illusion of control. Well, if only I wouldn't have done this, they wouldn't have gotten a divorce. And really, it's a mistake. Again, it's a mistaken attribute. I talk a little bit about ACE events. We'll talk about those later in the semester. But a lot of external events are actually determinative for people. So we also have something called self-fulfilling prophecy. You've heard about this before, I'm sure many of you. Look on page 107. We find causes where we look for them. And our beliefs often lead to what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy, a belief that leads to its own fulfillment. So if you want to look a little bit about that, you can look on page 107. There's also something that's pretty interesting called behavioral confirmation. It has to do with self-fulfilling prophecy. There's a cool example on page 113 where two people may like each other, but they're scared that the other person doesn't like them, and so they act kind of cool and standoffish around them. And so really they give behavioral confirmation that, well, that person doesn't like me. And then there's a self-fulfilling prophecy because the other person maybe might be attracted to them, but they're coming off kind of rude or cool. So might look at that too. Lastly, I like this quote. Comes from the Learned Hand, Spirit of Liberty in 1952. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which seeks to understand the minds of other men and women. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which weighs their interests alongside its own without bias. So we just had the passing of Senator John McCain this past week, and I put this in there last year. It didn't have any. It just so happened to correspond with this week, but I believe that has a lot to do with his belief system. Anyway, have a good week.